is CNN Breaking News.
Hey, I'm Brian Stelter. Merry Christmas Eve to you and your family. It's time for Reliable Sources, our weekly look at the story behind the story, of how the media really works and how the news gets made. Today is a special edition, a chance to critically examine President Trump's relationship with the press at the one-year mark. Are alternative facts the new normal? Are partisan extremes here to stay? And what's the significance of all the leaks to news outlets this year? And later, it's the one end-of-the-year list that you don't want to end up on. PolitiFact's top editor is here to share the lie of the year. But first, I want to take you back in time. You know, so much has happened this year, it's easy to forget some of the shocking developments. For example, when you hear these words, are you still shocked?
I have a running war with the media. They are among the most dishonest human beings on earth.
That is how it began. On Trump's very first day waking up in the White House, he turned on the TV and he turned angry at what he saw. Journalists were pointing out that the audience for his inauguration was smaller than Obama's. So Trump fired back, exaggerating his crowd size and then sending Sean Spicer out to defend him. You know, Trump even described the inauguration weather inaccurately. He said the skies became really sunny after his speech, when in fact it remained cloudy and started to rain a little bit. I think that's actually a metaphor for the year. Trump painted a dark picture of American carnage and then said he alone could fix it. He believed his world was always sunny. When Trump played loose with the facts and journalists challenged him on that, he couldn't stand it. I mean, here's an example you've probably forgotten. This is from February.
The murder rate in our country is the highest it's been in 47 years, right? Did you know that? 47 years. I used to use that. I'd say that in a speech and everybody was surprised because the press doesn't tell it like it is. It wasn't to their advantage to say that.
It wasn't to our advantage to say that because it wasn't true. Obviously, fact checkers jumped into action, trying to counter the claim that he was making about the murder rate. But, you know, Trump's really cynical, sinister view of journalism that we don't really want to tell people the truth, it came through in his comments all year long. Here's another example.
Radical Islamic terrorists are determined to strike our homeland. It's gotten to a point where it's not even being reported. And in many cases, the very, very dishonest press doesn't want to report it. They have their reasons, and you understand that.
There he is telling members of the U.S. military that the press was intentionally downplaying, even covering up terrorist attacks. If anything, the opposite is true. All year long, I heard anchors and reporters and editors reaching for new ways to say that's not true and that makes no sense. And all year long, I heard the president coming up with new ways to call us the enemy.
We are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake. A few days ago, I called the fake news the enemy of the people, and they are.
That was February. Now let's fast forward all the way to August.
Truly dishonest people in the media and the fake media. They make up stories. They have no sources in many cases. They say a source says there is no such thing, but they don't report the facts.
Some people have gotten numb to this, but these are really sinister claims from a world leader and totally unsupported by the real facts. I mean, heck, there were times this year that I used White House aides as anonymous sources because the aides would not speak on the record. Journalists don't go around making up sources. But look, the onus was and still is on us in the press to better explain why we do what we do. For example, why we agree to keep sources anonymous sometimes, how we vet our facts. Trump's daily media attacks have been a challenge and an opportunity. You know, so when he says something like this,
It's frankly disgusting the way the press is able to write whatever they want to write, and people should look into it.
yes, look into it. I think the more that you know about how newsrooms work, how journalists work, the more likely you are to know that it's not fake. Yes, one of the president's favorite words, fake. He told his supporters all year long that the press was out to get him, out to take him down. And many people believe it. The country is split on this question, and it's an ongoing issue for newsrooms. So let's bring in an all-star panel of decision makers and newsroom leaders. Sally Busby is the executive editor of the Associated Press. John Avlon's the editor-in-chief of the Daily Beast, as well as an analyst here at CNN. And Joanne Lippman is the chief content officer for the USA Today Network and the editor of USA Today. She's also the author of the upcoming book, That's What She Said, What Men Need to Know and Women Need to Tell Them About Working Together. Let's talk about Trump's attacks on the media and journalists' responses. Sally, this is your first year as the top editor at the AP. But before that, of course, you've been at the AP for many years. Was this the most challenging year to be an editor?
This was a very challenging year. There's no question. Both the extent of the interest in the Trump story globally, and I think that's one thing that's very important. It's not just Americans who pay an enormous amount of attention to this. People all over the world pay attention to the Trump presidency. And it's been difficult to get factual information out of this administration. I think, provided a lot of new challenges to reporters.
Yeah.
But it's also been such an important year, so important for the values that journalists hold dear, the importance of facts. And in some ways, it's been, although there have been a lot of challenges, it's been sort of a inspiring year in a way, in the sense that I personally believe that consumers of news are actually seeking out good journalism and actually understand its values. So for many of our journalists, there's been some affirmation this year, I think, too.
Joanne, are you seeing that as well in the traffic and the page views?
Well, certainly we're seeing there's a real interest in legitimate journalism. But I would also say I think one of the most important things within the media itself is to understand, is to not internalize what we're hearing. When we have attacks on the press from the president or anyone else, it's so important not to internalize that and
Well, let's be honest. That did happen sometimes, didn't it?
And it absolutely
People took it too personally.
Well, not just personally, but to take on the mantle of being the enemy, which the press is not. The press, our job is to shine a light in dark corners, to hold the powerful to account, no matter who the powerful are. And that's what we have to continue to do.
Marty Baron, the head of the Washington Post, said, "We're not at war with the administration. We're at work." But John, do you think most people believe that we're not at war with Trump?
I hope so, because that is really fundamentally what's happening here. Look, we are a guarantor of liberty. We are not the enemy of the American people. The founding fathers built in the First Amendment as a check on power grabs, to hold the power to account.
But you feel like you need to remind people of that nowadays, don't you?
Yes, I do. But I think also people are being reminded that they can't take democracy for granted, that the free press isn't free. And that itself has an invigorating effect that I think is actually the silver lining we can take from all these conflicts. Because this is sort of advanced civics people are experiencing in real time. A lot of the old certainties about liberal democracy that I think people assumed or believed was ascendant around the world inevitably are being pushed back, not just at home, but around the world. So this is a time for the free press to stand up, for citizens to stand up and get involved, because the alternative is too terrible to imagine.
Trump certainly has forced conversations about profound issues, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about the most important basic values that we all may share or not share. There's been stories this year about race and class and gender that have affected the White House. So in a way, he's enabled or encouraged some really important soul searching.
Yeah, it's the old, there must be a pony in here somewhere, and I think there are silver linings. I do think people are taking more civic responsibility. And I think you're seeing that even in subscription rates, people subscribing to newspapers in joining and membership models that they hadn't before. They were taking for granted that news content was free, but now they're understanding that they need to stand up and support independent journalism, that scoops matter, that investigative journalism matters, because that's what really holds power to account. And there may be great controversy around this, and we are all beset by social media trolls, and it's a bit of a novelty to be attacked by the President of the United States and the press, for some journalists personally. But I think we have to remain invigorated by the challenges and not exhausted, and realize that we have a gift of the fact that our mission is clearer than ever right now.
Thinking back to January and February versus now, I think there was a lot more anxiety early in the year among journalists, a lot more uncertainty about what a Trump administration was going to mean. Is it fair to say, Sally, that the worst fears some journalists had have not actually been realized? Meaning there have not been an explosion of libel lawsuits. The press has not been kicked out of the West Wing. The cameras are still on in the briefing room after a brief period when they were turned off. That maybe our worst fears have not been realized.
I mean, I do think that there is some truth to that. I think that we did not get kicked out of the White House. I do still have some concerns about, the Department of Justice has said that there are a lot of leaks investigations going on, for example. We have some indication that the Department of Justice is still looking at some ways to sort of potentially eliminate some of the protections that have guided reporters in legal fights and things like that. And a lot of that is still up in the open. I think there's also, frankly, a lot of journalists have actually kept their nose to the grindstone fairly well and chased facts. And I think that that has been the best thing that has happened this year. Every time we get distracted into sort of what I would call not terribly important fights with the White House, it takes us away from our main mission, which is to go out there and find out what is actually going on. What is the impact of the policy changes that are being made? What is happening inside the White House? What is actually factually happening? And within our organization, we have tried to say, do not get distracted by some of these more, sensational, but not necessarily as important disputes that have been going on, and try to keep your focus on what is really happening in this administration and your duty to report that to
That's
people.
been the most important thing, I think, this year that I have repeated again and again to our newsrooms is we've got to keep our eye on the ball, on the issues that are important, on the president's actions, not simply on the president's tweets.
Yes.
A researcher found that since 2015, the now president has posted about 1,000 anti-media messages on Twitter. So it does pile up. It does have an effect. John, I think it's a poisonous thing that he's constantly calling real outlets fake news. But to some degree, that is also a distraction.
Yeah, and look, it is absolutely our responsibility not to be distracted by things that are intended to be distractions, to focus on the facts of what actually impacts people, not just radioactive rhetoric. But the larger issue I think that we need to confront is something that is quite sinister, and the president is advocating, which is blurring the lines between fact and fiction. Fake news in the context of the 2016 campaign is something real. It's in stories written with the intent to deceive. They're sometimes for profit, sometimes for propaganda, but they had an impact on the election via social media. For the president to try to take that term back and direct it at credible news outlets, places that are filled with imperfect human beings, but who do check facts, who do correct mistakes, who are pursuing truth every day.
But what about the perception that journalists are so sloppy, they're making mistakes all the time? I mean, John, if you watch Sean Hannity show as often as I do, you must think that journalists are an evil species, constantly screwing up on purpose to hurt the president.
Right, and that would be false. But Sean Hannity lives in this sort of glass throne someplace out in
CNN did have 3 people resign because of an error. We've seen errors at other major news outlets as well. Brian Ross suspended this month.
And those are corrective. That is evidence of the fact that standards matter. And then when people make mistakes, they are, taken into account. I don't think, we should overcorrect because you're never going to please some folks. But look at also the source of the objections is an administration, unfortunately, led by a president who lies at an uncommon rate, even compared and especially compared to other presidents. So this disregard for truth got to flow both ways. Is coming from the president, not from the press. And we need to remain steadfast and insisting on a fact-based debate, recognizing that everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. And we can fight on that ground.
Can I just add, though, on this whole concept of fake news? Now, this is something I think is very dangerous just as a meme. I've actually instituted a rule at USA Today and the USA Today Network, which is 109 local newspapers like the Detroit Free Press and the Arizona Republic. We don't use that phrase because it's not correct, right? There's false information, there's propaganda. We need to call it what it is. But again, by internalizing that phrase and repeating it ourselves, it's a real misnomer. It's not news.
Quick break here. Let's keep this going right after a quick commercial break. On the other side, we're going to look back at Inauguration Weekend. Some of the questions we had then and whether we have any answers now. Stay with us. We're just getting started.
This is CNN Breaking News.
It's fake news, a hoax, just a lie perpetuated by losers. That's what President Trump said all year long when it came to questions about Russian interference in the U.S. election and whether any members of his campaign had a hand in it. But guess what? PolitiFact says that's the lie of the year. Yes, the claim that Trump has made over and over again, that Russian interference is a made-up story. PolitiFact says that was the biggest whopper of them all. Joining me now from Washington to discuss this is the editor of PolitiFact, Angie Holan. Angie, great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
You had so many options to choose from this year, so why this one on the top of your list of shame?
Well, it was repeated over and over again by President Donald Trump. He would say it as a defense of charges against collusion, which I should emphasize, we're not saying there was collusion. That's unproven. What we're saying is this Russian interference definitely happened. And President Trump has said several times that it hasn't. Well, it has. And it really goes to the heart of American democracy and our elections and how we decide who to pick to be our leaders in Congress and in the White House.
And his repetition, repeating it over and over again, calling it a hoax, does have an impact. I want to talk to you about that in a minute. But first, the runners-up, right? There were a couple of runners-up we can put on screen. In second place here, Republican Congressman Raul Labrador saying, quote, "Nobody dies because they don't have access to health care." Tell me about this one.
This is one that we were just very dubious about. I mean, there have been studies about whether people have great health care outcomes on different types of insurance, especially Medicaid. But the idea that nobody dies because they don't have access to health care, that's just wrong. And we talked to numerous health care researchers who were just like, yeah, no.
Hey, Angie, you went on a trip several different states this year talking with voters about how they perceive fact checks. Where were you? Tulsa, Mobile? What did you learn on these trips?
Well, we wanted to talk to voters who voted for Donald Trump and might be open to learning more about fact-checking, because we've seen survey data that says Trump voters are very suspicious of the media generally, and they're also suspicious of fact-checking. So we thought if we met them and listened to their concerns, we might learn better ways to do our job. They could hear about how we do our jobs and maybe be more open-minded to our reports. And the interactions were very positive. It's like when we get out from behind our computers and sit down face-to-face with people and have a conversation, it works really well. We just have to figure out how to scale that up.
So many people were receptive. At the same time, I don't mean to be a pessimist here on Christmas Eve, but I sometimes wonder if there is a portion of the country that is unreachable by fact checkers, that there's a portion of the country that does not want to hear any of the real news that's negative about the Trump administration. Has that been your experience as well? Has that been your finding?
I think there is a portion of partisans who do not want to listen to independent journalism. They see their political identification as part of who they are. And so, no, they're not open. And I don't think fact checkers are going to reach those people. But our reports might reach their friends, their family, people who could influence them. And what we're hoping to do as fact checkers is just get accurate, credible, vetted information into the hands of voters so they can make better decisions about who they want to support and how they want to see the country governed.
People spreading misinformation or ignoring fact checks, it's not exclusive to one side either. Your site reminded me about that video of Trump greeting a disabled boy at the White House. There were these claims that Trump had snubbed the boy, ignored the boy because he had a disability. I remember J.K. Rowling shared that video with millions of followers, and lots of liberals shared it and thought it was real. You all had to publish a fact check about that one as well.
Yes, we fact-checked that and rated it pants on fire, because if you looked at the whole video, you would see that when President Trump came in, he greeted the boy and gave him special attention. He didn't ignore him at all. But I think that goes